Improvised explosive devices are one of the biggest threat to NATO troops, but not only NATO troops. They kill even more Afghan civilians than NATO soldiers, tragically, in Afghanistan today. They're the ultimate asymmetric weapon. They're extremely cheap to manufacture. In some cases, they cost less than $5. The countermeasures, on the other hand, cost billions of dollars. They're very easy to place alongside roads and so on. Not always easy to detect if they don't, for example, contain metal parts. And unfortunately, whether we like it or not, these IEDs are going to be with us permanently from now on. For example, even beyond Afghanistan, there are over 400 cases every month in which IEDs are used in Africa, in Latin America, in other conflicts that take place around the globe. So it's very important that the expertise that we acquire in dealing with these terrible things isn't lost after Afghanistan, because that expertise is going to be needed in future NATO ground operations. You need obviously to work at several levels. At the policy level, you need to have a good understanding of the network that produces the IED threat. For example, these things need explosives. So are you doing what you can to prevent these materials reaching the Taliban and other insurgent groups in Afghanistan? If you can reduce the supply, you reduce the production rate, for instance. Do you have good biometrics and forensics so that when you can discover an IED, you can look for fingerprints, you can look for DNA, which will then be preserved and can help to bring the perpetrators to justice? That also is very important as well. Are you investing in detection, for example, through satellites and other things? So in other words, do you have the right network and the right cooperation between the military and the police, the intelligence services, to be able to dismantle the network? The operational level, of course, is making sure that in NATO we have an effective route clearance doctrine. That means, for example, harmonising and standardising the procedures, making sure that the best practices, the lessons learned are distributed in the alliance, that intelligence on IEDs captured, let's say, by the United States is immediately disseminated to all of the other ISAF countries. Organising exercises, as we do in NATO, to allow the US teams to compare their experiences with the Italian teams or the Belgian teams. Different countries have different equipment, different methodologies, and it's good therefore for them to compare and contrast their operating procedures to learn from each other, making sure that those people going to Afghanistan are trained by those people who have been there and therefore know what to expect and pass on the knowledge. So it's, as you can understand, a multifaceted challenge. The third level, of course, is the technological level, where we have to see what works best. For example, metal detectors, jamming devices, remote-controlled explosions. So we need to make sure that we are simultaneously working on all three fronts. And if you don't do all three things together, ultimately you're not going to be successful. We clearly face in Afghanistan, let me start with this, a situation where our troops need freedom of movement, both while they're doing the operation, because of course many of them move around on the ground in armoured vehicles out on patrol. They can't all go by helicopter. And secondly, of course, as you know, at the moment, we're looking at the withdrawal of ISAF from Afghanistan, which means that over the next 2 years, we have to move 160,000 containers, 60,000 vehicles out of the country, most of it going by road. So the freedom of movement on safe roads is going to be critical to that redeployment operation. So with that context in mind, we've organised a number of demonstrations in NATO in order to be able to test our procedures before this redeployment begins and improve our operational doctrine. We had one exercise in Le Petit in Belgium, which took place at the end of 2010 with about 220 participants, and we followed that up last June with a demonstration at the US training ground at Homefeltzer. The Homefeltzer demonstration was designed, as you can imagine, to achieve multiple things at the same time. The first thing was to allow various NATO teams to demonstrate their approaches. And these approaches are very different. For example, you have the United States, which has very impressive equipment and vehicles, the Huskies, for example, and a very high-tech approach. But you had others, like the Swedes, who came with dogs, but equally effective sniffer dogs, and demonstrated how they could be optimally used. The other thing was to look at not simply the removal of the device, but also how you clear the area, for example. In other words, scouting the terrain, because there could be other secondary devices planted. And then at the end, also very important, is we had a seminar where we could look a little bit at how the exercise had demonstrated gaps in the NATO doctrine. For example, different standards, lack of interoperability, lack of training, not capturing lessons learned. The idea being that we move before the redeployment in Afghanistan has finished, to a STANAG, a NATO standardization agreement, to standardize these procedures, which then of course become applicable throughout the alliance. And so what we are now doing is capturing all of the lessons learned in terms of our route clearance doctrine, and then deciding what future exercises we need to organise in order to fill the gap. The key thing in dealing with IEDs is, first of all, to defeat the network. Yes, we have to block these devices. Yes, we have to detect them. Yes, we have to protect our soldiers and their vehicles. But ultimately, these things are so cheap, so easy to manufacture and put into the ground, that we will always be chasing the problem unless we defeat the network that produces IEDs in the first place. The second key thing that we have to do is preserve all of the know-how that we've acquired in Afghanistan, because wherever NATO goes on an operation in future, wherever the United Nations goes, wherever the EU goes, they will be countering IEDs, and we should make sure that NATO circulates all of the good information so that we can protect others as well. Thirdly, I think that we need, of course, to improve our technology of detection. That means not just working on the ground, but very much also using satellites better, and drones, aerial surveillance, because you can see if Earth has been moved overnight. You can use thermal imaging to help, therefore, get a better idea. Let me mention one final thing also. ISAF is leaving Afghanistan in 2014. Afterwards, the responsibility is going to be in the hands of the Afghan security forces. Then they will have to deal with the IED problem. They have skills, particularly in terms of very brave soldiers who take these things out of the ground. But they don't have satellites, they don't have drones, they don't have all of the technical things that NATO has. So what kind of technologies can we pass on to the Afghans, which they will be able to use and sustain? That's also something that we need to consider.